Right, hello folks. At long last I'm back with the next installment of the Invasion Threat series. This is part 5 and we're only just now getting to the part of the invasion threat that everyone knows about. So just to pick up where I last left off, last time I covered mid to late May 1940, which was probably about 8 months or so ago. These things take a lot of time to put together. But this time we'll take a look at June 1940, which is when things really start to kick off. As a result of this, what I'm currently planning on doing with this series is to run it alongside some other stuff so that I can keep some content going through the channel. So we'll start looking at how the defences of the UK were planned, and we'll start that from 1939 and push onwards. And what I'll do is, so what I've seen from my research so far is that as of June 1940, the invasion threat is starting to get extremely complex, as we'll see in this next video. So in this video, I'll be looking at just one assessment, which was made on the 6th of June 1940, looking at the invasion threat as of that date. And as we'll see, this is extremely detailed, and from this period onwards, up until around towards the end of 1940, things start to get really, really complex. And as a result of this, I'm going to start pushing on with this, but I think the best way to do it is for me to assess each assessment that was made by the Chief of Staff Committee. Right. As always with this videos, I want to make it very, very clear that it doesn't matter if you don't think the invasion was viable. That is not the aim of these videos. The aim of these videos is to present the threat of invasion as how it was seen and perceived and assessed by the Home Forces, the military organisation responsible for defending the UK during the Second World War, as well as the War Cabinet's Chief of Staff Committee and the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee. So as always with this stuff, I'll be relying heavily on things like the Cabinet War Files, which are my main primary source for this stuff. I am also using a script for this because there's a lot of information to remember, and that's one of the reasons why I'm looking to what's my right a lot. So, as always, I'm using the Cabinet War Files, which are provided by the National Archives in Kew in England, and references for these are provided at the bottom of the relevant slides. In this case, it's just going to be one source one report that I'm using, but you can see the source as outlined here at the bottom of the page. So, as with last time as well, I won't be consulting any war diaries, as again, I think the Cabinet War Files gives enough insight into the invasion threat of as it was in early June 1940. Okay, so by late May 1940, the Wehrmacht had started to push into France, with France eventually capitulating on the 22nd of June 1940, leaving the situation on the continent looking something like this. It does say early June 1940, late May, early June 1940 here, but I've decided just to show France as having fully capitulated on this date, and as a result, once France had capitulated, it remained this way. This is what the picture would look like in terms of the invasion threat to the UK as until about 1944 when the Allies decided to reinvade France. So I recommend looking elsewhere for more information on the Battle of France and the lowland countries, because that's not something I'm going to be covering in this video, but I'm sure there's some videos out there where you can find out more information about that. But it's not my area of expertise, and I won't be covering that in comparison with what was going on in the UK. And although this video will look at one of the reports that was compiled on the 6th of June looking at the invasion threat, obviously at this point the fighting was still ongoing in France very much so, and France didn't capitulate until the 22nd of June 1940. But for ease of reference, and as the report itself that we'll be looking at preempts the future invasion threat based on potential German advances in northern France, I will just show France has capitulated at this time, because the impression I'm getting from this is the Commander-in-Chief's the Chiefs of Staff Committee were erring on the side that France was going to fall. That's the impression, or the impression that I'm getting from this document. They are starting to assess threats across the whole of northern France, as we'll see later. So yes, it's not historically accurate for this time on the 6th of June, but I have shown, for ease of reference, that the entirety of France has fallen at this date, just to clear that up, just in case anyone says anything. Right. Okay, so we are primarily going to be looking at this report by the War Cabinet's Chief of Staff Committee, which was a report also incorporating information from the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, which was compiled on the 6th of June 1940. So, on this date, the Chiefs of Staff Committee met and instructed the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, or JISC, to prepare an up-to-date assessment of the threat of invasion to the UK. And this report outlines the threat of invasion to the UK as determined by the Chiefs of Staff Committee, as it was on the 6th of June. And this is quite a big document. There's a lot of information going on there, on in this, and it's probably the first time that we're going to see the full invasion picture start to rear its head, having seen what was going on in 1939 and 1940. So the COSC outlined in their report the most likely form and scale the invasion would take, as well as the time of publication on the 6th of June. As always, their assessment was highly detailed. So let's start by taking a look. Okay, so they summarised that the Germans could attempt an invasion at the same time as advancing into France, but the attack on France would absorb most of the forces required for an invasion. And it was quite clear here from previous experience of the Germans fighting that they were currently focusing on one key objective at a time. Rather than trying to do multiple things, they would focus on one thing, then move on to something else. And this was an assessment made by the COSC. So taking this as a guide, it was determined that although the Germans had the capability to potentially push into France and invade France and invade the UK at the same time, it was unlikely that the Germans would attempt to invade while advancing into France. But an invasion of the UK would be Germany's final aim, as it was determined here, and it was likely that an invasion would be pushed with maximum intensity with little concerns for loss and all resources put into an invasion attempt, as this would be seen as their kind of final objective following the invasion of France. Okay. So it was likely, as we've seen before, that the invasion would comprise of several separate operations. So this would be generally an airborne attack followed by a naval attack, with then airborne landing of paratroopers and finally a seaborne invasion. At this point, though, the COSC outlined that the airborne and naval attack would likely be undertaken simultaneously, so the aim here is to overwhelm the kind of naval forces and the landborne forces, as well as using enemy aircraft, the Luftwaffe to wipe out the RAF and take out the the naval forces. And then, if the airborne attack was successful, this operational airborne attack across, the aiming to knock out the RAF and naval forces or deplete the Royal Navy. If this was successful, then this would be followed up by the dropping of paratroopers and the landing of troops by sea in both Eire / the Republic of Ireland or mainland Britain. It's also likely at this time as well that the Germans would make abundant use of subterfuge and ruse to mislead the defenders as much as possible. So, the preliminary air offensive was likely to focus on knocking out the RAF, combined with sabotage and fifth column activity on the ground aimed at depleting the RAF. The airborne attack would likely focus on aerodromes, storage and maintenance depots in the aircraft industry, as well as government and military centres and centres of communication and transportation. So essentially knocking out the aircraft industry, knocking out the RAF, knocking out any means of logistics and support of the RAF, but also aimed to completely disorganise the country as well. The Navy would also be targeted with the aim of reducing the force as much as possible, as it was unlikely the German Navy would be able to take them head-to-head without some form of attrition to the Royal Navy in advance. So the aim was to use the Luftwaffe to knock out the Royal Navy as much as possible before they made contact with the German Navy. It was also estimated that a total of 4,800 tons of bombs per day were to be expected, and I'd actually like to see how this compared to what was dropped on a daily basis during the Battle of Britain for comparison, to see how accurate that assessment was. So, the preliminary airborne attack would be on potentially the south and west coasts from air bases in France, and as well as the east and Scottish coasts from Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and interestingly enough, Germany itself. So that would have looked something like this. So you can see that pretty much the entirety of the UK, or the entirety of the UK's coastline, was under threat of airborne attack, and these were the key areas which kind of would be hit in terms of the Royal Navy, but also on land in terms of knocking the RAF out. Okay. So, preliminary, it's a hard word for me to say that. Preliminary naval operations would aim to draw defending submarines and naval forces away from the invasion routes, as well as mine the approaches to naval bases to keep the naval forces tied up in base. So the key aims here of the German Navy would be to draw defenders away, including submarines and the naval forces, away from where the invasion shipping was going to advance, as well as to try and hem the Royal Navy into their bases by mining the approaches to their bases. So the preliminary, I still can't say it, preliminary airborne invasion would focus on capturing landing grounds and coastal defences adjacent ports, as well as suitable beaches for landing of an invading force by sea, as well as attacking potentially the government, transportation and communications hubs following that preliminary aerial bombardment. There was also the potential as well that the paratroopers would aim at capturing munitions factories and depots, and even potentially capture and release friendly or German POWs and Italian POWs, which is interesting. Also note as well that the focus would be on capturing landing grounds to hopefully bring in further supplies, as well as knock out the coastal defences surrounding adjacent ports, which would then be a primary objective of the seaborne force. So, as I've already mentioned, the airborne force comprising of paratroopers would act itself as the precursor to the landing of the other land forces by sea. Interestingly as well, fifth column activity would focus on arson to destroy public utilities such as electric and gas networks, and destroying the communications network as well to make it extremely difficult for the military to communicate effectively via the telephone network. The fifth column would also potentially be tasked with attacking military columns on the ground, as well as refugees, to cause confusion. You can probably hear our washing machine now finishing in the background. Great. Right. Where are we? So, the fifth column would also potentially indicate targets to be bombed from the air, and also spreading false news as well, which sounds very familiar. Right. So, in summary, there was a little brief summary provided at the end of this section. So in summary, the initial landborne invasion would come from the air, with Germany capable of dropping somewhere in the region of 9,750 lightly equipped paratroopers in one single flight, which is quite a sizable force. Okay. So it was also then surmised, in light of ground opposition and the need for the enemy to land heavy arms and light tanks, that the initial landings would amount to no more than 10,000 enemy in East Anglia and somewhere in the region of 20,000 in Kent, but this could only be achieved with air superiority. Also note the possibility of landing of small bodies of troops by glider around the Kent coast, but this threat was seen as extremely limited. You'll also see in my other video on anti-landing obstacles a proper appreciation of the glider threat and a proper insight into how limited the glider threat was seen, and how it is largely overblown today as a threat during the invasion scares of 1940 onwards. The threat of gliders is minimal, and it was determined, to summarise my other video, which I'd recommend you watch, it was determined at the time that there was very little you could do to defend against gliders. But yeah, watch that video. It's also interesting in this section that, as I mentioned, that Germany has somewhere in the region of around 100 seaplanes that could then be used to land troops in areas such as on isolated waterways, such as on the Humber, the Norfolk Broads, and even reservoirs. Okay, nice little mention of Ireland here. So Ireland itself gets overlooked today, but was actually seen as a key vulnerable point or vulnerable area from air landings in 1940 onwards. There was also the possibility of support by the IRA for an invading force as well. So the aim of invading Ireland would be to attack the vulnerable west flank of the mainland UK via the coast, which is why the west coast of Wales, Scotland and England was also defended, and we see defences on that coastline today. So this west flank of the country is often overlooked today, but this key threat was from Ireland, and this is one of the reasons why we need to assess these defences today and the actual history of them, because we see that the entirety of the UK was vulnerable to some form of invasion threat as perceived by the Chiefs of Staff. Right. Oh yeah, an additional objective of the enemy threatening Ireland would also be to ensure the dispersal of defending forces, making it difficult to concentrate forces in the mainland UK for defence. So ideally, essentially splitting up the defenders to try and split them up as much as possible to make them less effective in terms of defence. Okay. Then, in terms of what they call the Seabourn Expedition or the Seabourn Invasion, similar to previous assessments, the airborne landings of troops would soon be followed by the seaborne force due to the difficulty of supplying the airborne force from the air. The idea being to land your seaborne force to help them, to allow them then to resupply the airborne force which had been dropped in advance. Interestingly, even at this point in 1940, when the lowland countries had fallen and France was being invaded, the chiefs of staff were still convinced the main invasion fleet would come from ports in northern Germany, which is quite surprising even to me. So, firstly, this was determined to be likely to ensure surprise, but also I assume as because recently captured ports in Belgium and Holland had only just been captured and hadn't actually been repaired, and ships moved to them to allow soldiers to be embarked to invade the UK. But again, the threat was seen as extremely serious, and it is believed that Germany will put everything into executing a seaborne invasion, irrespective of losses. Wide dispersion of the attacking force was to be expected, which would rely heavily on all forms of attack, be it airborne, paratroopers, and the fifth column, with these forces that were going to invade likely relying on capturing resources such as petrol as much as possible and other resources to ensure that their attack was a success. Okay. So the seaborne force could be landed by ordinary transport ships, transports capable of self-contained unloading, specially developed landing craft, fast motorboats, naval surface ships, and even U-boats. So pretty much any form of floating craft conceived or conceivable. So I think that pretty much covers everything. It was also outlined that the enemy may assemble its seaborne landing force quickly and also disperse the force to try and evade aerial reconnaissance. So try and evade aerial reconnaissance to provide an early warning to the threat of invasion. So interestingly, next it was outlined that the seaborne attack would most likely come on a dark night or early dawn to evade defending fighters, which is interesting. We've not seen that mentioned before, but also on a high tide as well. So this is quite a specific requirement. The periods where you're going to have a high tide under these light conditions is probably going to be very rare. But I guess this was because at the time the enemy would have needed air superiority, and in light of not having air superiority, one of the key and easy ways for them to effect a seaborne landing would be to undertake it the cover of darkness to negate the need for having air superiority at the time. It doesn't make that abundantly clear, but that's my assessment of that. As had previously been assessed, though, an area with potential for fighter and bomber cover would be required for a seaborne landing, as well as a coastline with favourable landing beaches. So, the Chief of Staff Committee determined that the most likely invasion area or area to be used for a seaborne invasion and seaborne landing would be from the Wash at the north of Norfolk all the way down to Newhaven. So finally, after all this time, on part 5 of this series, we finally get the south coast in joining the invasion party after long last. But it gives you an idea of how late to the party the south coast was. Right, let's all have a little celebration of that. Right, so considering the assumption that ports in northern Germany would be used, visually this is what that invasion threat of the seaborne force looks like, something like this. So an area from the Wash to the north all the way down to Newhaven, with the invasion force likely to come from ports in northern Germany, as was assessed by the War Cabinet's Chief of Staff Committee. Yeah, looks like something like that. I can't get the arrows quite right in QGIS, but they give an idea of kind of like the primary areas where seaborne force could land, as an example. Okay. So it's also worth noting that the Chief of Staff Committee also outlined that the western extent of the invasion area would likely expand further to the west the further the Germans advanced into northern France. So they are, as I mentioned earlier, they are preempting northern parts of northern France to continue to fall. It was outlined as well that if Germany intended to invade with 5 divisions, that would require around 200 to 250 ships. But armoured vehicles would also need to be unloaded at ports, so the enemy would struggle to limit itself to hitting the area between the Wash and Newhaven without specialist landing craft. Very interesting stuff. But it also outlines here that ports further north could be invaded, such as Hull, Immingham, etc. But these were now considered outside the area of maximum air effort of the Germans. In other words, outside the possible effective air coverage at the time. So we're starting to see this initial threat to ports on the eastern coast, such as the Humber and further north, starting to be ruled out in terms of invasion threats. So that's really interesting to see, and I want to see later on how this develops to see whether this threat of invasion the invasion threat stays at the northern extent of the Wash and then pushes further down the south coast. I want to take a key look at that later on. Right. Okay, what are we on? Slide 20. Alongside all this, there was also detailed assessment of the naval threat and how the Royal Navy could expect to be engaged. This is almost outside the scope of this talk, but I'm going to kind of summarise this as much as possible. But if you want to find the original document, the references at the bottom of the page, bottom of the screen there. So at this time, it was now determined that it was unnecessary to try and forecast the exact location where the Germans would land, since they would quite happily accept risks to make a landing anywhere a success. They could overcome the navigational issues associated with trying to land anywhere on the UK's coast, and with special landing craft they could essentially land anywhere across the coast of the UK anyway. So that's a really interesting thing now. At this point, as of the 6th of June, they are no longer aiming to kind of forecast and determine exactly where the Germans are going to land, because they could land almost literally anywhere as early as the 6th of June 1940. So the view now, though, was that an invasion was more likely to make landfall between Kent and Sussex, the Kent and Sussex coasts, as well as the area south of the Wash, due to the favourable air cover and military objectives in those areas, as well as the ability to cut off London from the west. So that would have been the key objective here from the perspective of the COSC, would be attacking and capturing London, or attacking London from its western flank. It was also noted, though, that any landings on the coast of Sussex would involve forcing the Dover Strait, which was extremely heavily defended at the time. The enemy was likely to deploy heavy surface forces as a distraction to draw the Royal Navy away from the invading fleet, which is something we saw in one of the previous videos in this series. The Germans were intending to send Gneisenau and Scharnhorst into the North Sea to draw the Royal Navy away. Interestingly as well, it was agreed that the Royal Navy would still be superior to the German Navy, and that the Germans could not expect to retain security over their seaborne communications with the landing force for more than 24 hours. This is extremely significant as a number of time. In other words, as an amount of time, sorry. In other words, the invading force was likely to be cut off from supply and reinforcements by the Royal Navy after 24 hours, from the perspective of the defenders. Interesting stuff. In other words, sorry, I've already said that bit, but it was possible that the Germans might try, as a result of this, to rush a large enough force onto a beachhead, and may attempt to rush troops into places like the Humber and Thames estuaries, as well as ground transport and landing beaches, irrespective of losses, to make sure that this initial landing force was well equipped, a success, and also deployed in large enough numbers to continue fighting even though they were cut off, which is an interesting perspective. Again, Ireland gets mentioned here, and this time in regards to reports, intelligence reports that the seaborne force may also be deployed from Spain, because it's worth remembering at this time, yes, Spain was neutral, but it was also very favourable to the Nazis. But that's an interesting insight there. So conclusions then, the section of the report concludes very succinctly that an invasion is likely to be preceded by feints and diversions in order to confuse the defenders. Again, which is really quite interesting. Okay. In terms of the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, then, they provide a detailed assessment of the German strengths, outlining that the German army at the time currently has somewhere in the region of 75 to 80 divisions involved in the invasion of France. I don't know whether that's accurate or not. It's not my area of expertise, but with somewhere in the region of 30 to 40 divisions still in Germany, and 25 to 30 of those divisions currently being formed. In comparison, it also outlines that the Allies only have 49 divisions to oppose the German divisions in France on the 6th of June 1940. However, it's determined that as long as France continues to resist, the enemy's forces are most likely to be focused on the invasion of France and not mainland Britain or the UK. Any units that are turned towards invading the UK after are likely to be those that are best trained and experienced in opposed landings, which the Germans are determined to have ample experience of. And then also armoured fighting vehicles landed in support are likely to be landed by specialist landing craft. and this is the assessment by the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, which is rather interesting. The German Navy, their forces are outlined quite detailed fashion, but just to summarise, the German Navy had battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and two old battleships and a range of additional ships, which I'll let you look up in this document. In terms of Luftwaffe, then, the Germans would be likely to soon establish air bases across Holland, Belgium, and northern France to allow them to have air superiority over the UK. But we're just going to focus on the statistics looking at transport aircraft available for the dropping of paratroopers. So the JISC, Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, determined that Germany had 500 Junkers Ju-52s, which were available for the immediate dropping of paratroopers, as well as an additional 100 Junkers Ju-86s and 50 unspecified 4-engined aircraft also available to drop paratroopers immediately. There were also an additional 650 to 700 Ju-52s, which were not immediately available, either being used by transport echelons or even schools, aircraft training schools. But these could eventually be mustered to support an invasion as well. So at this total strength, these aircraft were estimated to be able to drop somewhere in the region of 20,250 paratroopers in one go. Right. Okay. So, oh yeah, that slide there, which is the statistics of the Ju-52. If you want to find that, have a look out. So the transport aircraft, have a look at that. Okay, so after all that, we once again have a very, very complicated and messy picture drawn by the defenders, assessing the threat and refining what they know. You know, we can clearly see that the invasion threat now, once you map it out, it was clearly seen as being across the whole of the UK, giving the defenders a much more difficult task than what we see today in terms of defending the UK, but also showing as well that what the defenders and what the Chief of Staff Committee and the Home Forces and the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee had determined was much more widespread than what we see by just looking at the German plans for attack. And again, this is only the 6th of June 1940. We need to continue to understand that the invasion threat evolved over time. It didn't remain static. It was constantly being reassessed as well. So hopefully this video showing what the Chiefs of Staff had determined on the 6th of June 1940 has been of use and provides an additional insight into the invasion threat as it developed, and shows you again that much more research needs to be done into this period. Hopefully this video series will be kind of like one of the definitive insights into this period using primary sources which no one else has really done. So I think that's enough as always for one day. After all that, I'll pick up on the next assessment of the invasion threat. I'll find that in the primary sources, and we'll take another look in the future through the lens of the defenders and not the attackers in a future episode. I'll see you all later. I hope that's been alright. See you later and goodbye.